Welcome to this Women's History Month lecture on Mary Wollstonecraft. She's one of my favorite philosophers. We were talking just about women philosophers earlier. And this talk is called a Feminist Philosopher and Exemplar, in part because not only was she somebody who explicitly calls herself a philosopher, she really was an example of what it was that she was talking about and teaching about. She was pretty extraordinary, what she accomplished in her time. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably everybody, I'm Greg Sadler. I've recently moved back to the Milwaukee area after being gone for 20 years. I'm a philosopher by profession, consultant, a speaker, and that's if you want to know more, I can tell you more later on. Wollstonecraft is somebody who I've been interested in for quite a long time, and I've taught her main work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, in classes several times. I've also created a sequence of videos about her, and I'm working on an article on Wollstonecraft and virtue ethics. She's also somebody who I think she really got short shrift, not only in her own time, which we'll talk about why that was the case, but even today. She tends to get taught in sort of a token manner. We need a woman philosopher, let's throw Wollstonecraft in there. And it's really a shame because she is somebody who's quite brilliant in her own right. I think she deserves much more study than she gets. So what I want to do in this talk is I want to first kind of situate her in her own era and her culture. And then I'm going to talk about her life and her works. And I want to focus on this particular work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and discuss its context and the contributions that it's making. So some of the handouts that I've given you actually have to do with those sorts of things. I also want to tell you a little bit about the you might call it the follow-up story. She dies pretty young. Her work continues on after her, but there's a major blow to her reputation that comes about through her own husband's biography of her that ends up, you might say, putting her work on ice for quite some time. And I want to talk about how that happened. And then I'll open the floor to general discussion and Q&A, but you should feel free to ask questions at any time. I'm a pretty garrulous speaker, so I don't have any problem going off point, coming back onto point. Don't feel worried about that. If there's anything that's unclear or confusing or you want to know more about, just stop me and ask me, and I'll talk probably at great length about it. So, her life and her biography and her works. I created a biographical literary timeline for you that shows when some of her works were published, what some of the things that she got involved with, it gives you the years so you can kind of index them. She really is a child of the late 18th century. So we're talking about somebody whose consciousness is being formed around the same time that these great tumultuous revolutions are happening. She's not going to play a part in the French Revolution, fortunately, because she probably would have lost her head if she did. But she's a commentator on it. And she sees the American Revolution happen. She's seeing all sorts of interesting developments throughout the world. She's born in 1759, and she's born in London to a family that has some real problems. Her father is abusive towards her mother. He also tends to get involved in speculative schemes and moves them around from place to place as their financial situation improves or worsens. He ends up moving the family in such ways as to break off relationships or to force them to become epistolary relationships. You can tell that Mary, as a child, is somebody who is very much interested in education and sometimes held back quite a bit because of what's going on with her family. She's also taking care, if I remember right, she's the second in order of the children, so she's taking care of some of the younger children as well. She has some very close friendships early on. with other young women. And a lot of that has to do with education. With one of her close friends, Jane Arden, she gets to spend time with Arden's family and gets her education furthered in that way because they take an interest in her, something her parents are not interested in at all. She becomes friends with this other woman, Fanny Blood, who later on she will move to Portugal to nurse as she's dying. And they have all these great dreams of living a life of the mind together, starting their own, almost like a little tiny commune in a way. And what ends up happening is, if you look at sort of the timeline, she's not publishing stuff right away. That's going to happen later on. But she's reading, she's studying, she's thinking, she's engaging with the ideas of the time. She's also sort of reaching out for a way that she might be able to support herself, in part because her father had squandered what would have been her dowry, which was a big deal at the time. It was a major part of things. She tries out some professions that were sort of at that time the typical, atypical women's professions. So most women were being prepared, as she's going to talk about in the Vindication, for a domestic life, for getting married, for carrying on, the life of a household, raising children, that sort of thing. Or they were going to, if they weren't lucky enough for that, they would be servants or something else. The alternatives at the time, she tried them. They were to teach school. She founds a school with her sisters and with Fanny Blood, which she ends up having to close after a while. She tries out being a companion to a lady, which means that you essentially just travel around and listen. If they're nice, you get to spend a lot of nice time with them. If they're not so nice, you got to listen to their nonsense day in, day out, and kind of nod and agree. She tries being a governess, which also has her responsible for education. And she learns a lot from all of these in the process that she's going to talk about in some of her works. But she wants to do something, more unconventional than that. And she wants to do it in part because she doesn't see why she, as a woman, should be held back from engaging in not just a man's world, but a human world. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why she's such an important figure. She's writing in the Vindication of the Rights of Women about how important it is to create opportunities for women to do the things that they weren't being allowed to do. She goes ahead and just does them. And so she's really, we say somebody talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk. She's walking the walk before she's talking the talk in many respects. So she decides eventually, like I put here in 1787, she decides that she's going to become an author. And, I think for us, that's not that big of a deal because, we can easily become authors. Amazon has self-publishing. All you got to do is make yourself a book, send it out there, and you're an author. There's more to it than that, of course, but, it's fairly simple for us. It used to be that you had to find a publishing house and get them to be interested in your stuff, or pay somebody to publish your things with a vanity press. In her day, there weren't women authors, or there were some, but there were so few that you could count them like she does in her book in a few pages, and they weren't earning their living as professional authors. They would be somebody who you might say does this as like we talk about people having a boutique business, right? And by that we mean somebody who doesn't really have to earn money with their business. That's the way a lot of authors were at the time. They might be noble women, or they're already well established for some other reason. She decides that I'm going to earn my living as an author. And so that's an extraordinary decision on her part. She connects up with Joseph Johnson, and who has a publishing house, and he introduces her to this entire circle of people in London. She also, like I put here on the timeline, learns German and French so that she can begin translating. And some of her authorial credits are as a translator of important works that were published by Joseph Johnson. So she moves in these very radical and progressive circles. And if you think about what's going on around this time, it's 2 years before the French Revolution happens. It's already after the American Revolution and the sort of consolidation of things. It took a while after the Revolution for them to figure out what they wanted to do with this republic. They all split up into 4 different units, and there's a lot going on in London. A lot of thinking about society and the rights of human beings, classes, and there's some discussion about the condition of women as well. So she is involved in this pretty radical set of circles, and she ends up having an affair, but what we would nowadays call an emotional affair. You guys are all, I think, familiar with this term, where you're not actually sleeping with somebody else, but you're spending an awful lot of time. She gets involved with this guy, Fuseli, a Swiss painter, who's there, who's considerably older than her, and paints her portrait, leads her on quite a bit. She gets very infatuated with him, and eventually will propose a sort of amorous but platonic threesome with him and his wife. At that point, the wife, said, "Forget this," and their relationship is ended at that point. But it's quite dramatic. She also gets involved very briefly with the guy who later on in life will become her husband, William Godwin. She meets him, and according to what he said, she argues with him the entire night. And it was not a very pleasant evening for him, but he was impressed by her intellect. And they sort of part paths, and she ends up, after that, leaving for Paris. She starts getting involved in events and cultural circles there after the Revolution. And now you notice that she's already got a few things published by that point. In Paris, she is going, in France at least, she's going to publish the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And it's not published in France, it's published back in London. That's really her most important work. She had published the Vindication of the Rights of Man 2 years earlier to sort of support these revolutionary ideas against people like Burke, who was writing against them at the time. Now, shortly after that, she gets involved with this guy, Gilbert Imlay. And he's very euphemistically described as an adventurer, which sounds very dramatic. It's probably better to call him a con artist. He ends up getting involved with her. She becomes pregnant. She's in love with him. He seems to have just been using her. And there's this long set of letters between them. She ends up having her first child out of wedlock in revolutionary France. Pretty surprising that she doesn't actually die while she's there, because she's pretty much on her own, dealing with everything that's going on. She goes back to London in 1795 to try to find Imlay. He rejects her. He actually did register her as his wife, just to keep things easy for her, as easy as they could be in revolutionary France. But he had no intention of staying with her. And she becomes quite despondent. There's 2 suicide attempts. First one, trying to poison herself. The second one, she doesn't just try. She jumps into the Thames and gets fished out. Which, pretty easy to kill yourself that way in those times. Then she decides she's doing a last thing to try to reconnect with him. She goes to Scandinavia, acting on his behalf as sort of an agent for him. And she writes these letters to him. He pretty much ignores her, and she decides to call it quits, which is really good for her. She'll publish the letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, because they're not just about this Imlay guy. They're all about the landscape and her ideas about things that they provoke. William Godwin reads those. And William Godwin, according to him, he's kind of a romantic, so we have to take this with a grain of salt, says that on reading those letters he falls in love with her. And she will end up reconnecting with him as she comes back to London and connects back up with Johnson's circles. And those two will become married for a very short time, unfortunately, because they have a child themselves, and who we know as Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft will die not long after that due to complications. Things that nowadays would not be a problem, but when you got an infection back then, that was pretty much a death sentence unless your body threw it off.
Did she keep the first daughter?
Yes.
Oh, she did. So she was raising both children for a period. Yeah.
Well, she dies,
pretty quickly after the first.
Yeah, and we were just talking about this before that. She's already suffering from an infection. So how much was she really there to see what was going on? Probably not too much. But she does. She takes this other daughter. She takes her around when she goes to Scandinavia. She's just got this daughter and a maid, and they're traveling around. It's very tough to do at the time. I mean, nowadays it's easy to travel, but back then, not quite so much. So the story doesn't end there, as you see in the timeline, because shortly after that, Godwin is going to publish a book that's going to end up destroying her reputation, a biography. The memoirs of the author of the Vindication of the Rights of Women. He's going to do this even after Johnson says, this is a terrible idea, you need to get rid of the parts of the book that are completely scandalous, or if you're going to keep them in there, don't write about them in a scandalous way, because Godwin sort of goes over the top, treating her suicide attempts as if they're a sign of sort of heroic sensibility. It's very romantic thing. And he seemed to think that this would be great. This would just cement her reputation. Instead, it really sets it behind quite a bit. It's not until the 1830s that new editions of the Vindication are published. And in its own time, the Vindication was already being published in multiple editions. It had been translated into French. So, there's this great rise and a great fall. By the 1880s, we see her first official biography besides the memoirs coming out. And in 1879, her letters to Imlay are published. And that's sort of the end of the story. As far as the life and biography and the works. What I'd like to also talk about is this book itself, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. So it's being published after the French Revolution is underway, and quite a few events have already taken place. Wollstonecraft has made her reputation as an author by this time, and is already involved in discussions about, is the revolution a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How's it going to affect, people's lives, the ordinary people? And so there's a revolution controversy going on in Britain. Now, what occasions this piece, and actually the introduction to it, she's writing a sort of a dedication. You're not going to find this in any of the handouts, by the way. I see people looking through them. But she writes a dedication to this guy, Talleyrand, who is going to become a diplomat for Napoleon later on. Talleyrand, at that time, publishes a report on public instruction to the National Assembly. So these are the legislators deciding things in France. And what sets her off is that he suggests that there should be universal education for men. So public education, men need to be trained to their duties. This is going to be a great thing. For women, domestic education is appropriate. And domestic education means essentially homeschooling without any curriculum. It could be whatever you want it to be, probably a lot of handicraft stuff, whatever the person is going to do. Because women should be, supporting the revolution. The way that they will support the revolution is by supporting their men. So Wollstonecraft sees this, and like a lot of women at the time, she's got some contemporaries who are voicing similar sentiments. One of them, Olympe de Gouges, manages to get herself killed by the Jacobins for this. They say, well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. If we're going to have a new society and we're going to talk about equality and liberty, why is it just for the guys? Why are we sort of reinforcing the one down position of women if we're trying to change society? Now, some of them, made sort of piecemeal arguments. Wollstonecraft decides that she wants to tackle this whole issue head on, and we'll talk about how she did that in just a minute. She writes this piece very quickly in 1792, gets it off to the press, they crank it out, and they start publishing it. Afterwards, she's going to edit it a bit, add a bit more, but she wants to get this in there right away. It's intended to be the first part of a multi-volume set of works. That never ends up coming about. If she'd lived longer, maybe we would have seen that, because we do see some notes getting published later on. The work is widely read. It has an American edition. That's one way you could tell that you were an important author, if they would publish a separate edition over in the former colonies, which at that time, that's the way they looked at it. And a French translation. French translation is very important because that's who she's trying to reach. She gets attacked by the right people, the people who you would expect to attack it, like the anti-Jacobin people in France. So, it's sort of like when you're a teacher. If the good students like what you're doing and the bad students hate what you're doing, you're probably doing things right? Same way with this. It influences quite a few people, including other women writers. And so this really cements her reputation. And if we think about the importance of the work, we can say, with any given work, we can ask whether it's really important, and it might be important in a couple different ways. So a work could be important because it influenced other writers, shaped historical contexts. There's a lot of works like that. We don't read too many of them these days, or require people to read them in classes unless we're doing a history class, or unless we're interested in that topic ourselves. So, for knowing about ancient Greece, I think Xenophon is great. If you want to understand Socrates, it's good to read Xenophon, but most people are probably not going to read Xenophon, right? And that's okay. So there's that kind of historical importance. But for a philosopher, and she called herself a philosopher, so we can take her seriously by that criterion. We want to ask, are there ideas that are of lasting value there? Should we keep reading this book today? That's a viable question, and it's a fair question to ask. And the answer shouldn't be, yeah, because I like reading it, so everyone else should have to read it too. We should be able to make a case to people why this is a valuable work. So does it set out some ideas or arguments that are essential, that retain their relevance, we can ask. And in Wollstonecraft's case, the answer is yes. This really is a great work today, just as great as it was 200 years ago. So it's still worth reading. That's not an answer that's recognized by a lot of people in my field of philosophy, unfortunately. But maybe that'll change in the future. When our work does get looked at, it's often sort of pushed off to feminist philosophy or gender studies or things like that. And there's kind of a catch-22 that goes along with that, I think. She gets treated as a token. And here's sort of the problem with that. And I think it's kind of a sign of the muddle that we're in as far as thinking these matters through. She's being treated as just a feminist, you might say, writer or philosopher. And in philosophical circles, that's a sign that maybe there's something a bit exclusive or parochial to those sorts of claims. Being more than just a feminist would presumably involve reference to something more essential to the human condition. And then, the question is, well, does being a feminist preclude that? I don't think it does, but I think that quite a few of my peers think that it does. My own take on this is that I found myself being attracted to her work, not because it was written by a woman or because we should have more women in philosophy. I think that's actually true, but it's not interesting as far as this goes, but because she's dealing with universal themes. How how should we live our lives? How do people have to structure society? Now she's writing as a woman, and that's informing what she has to say, so that she says some things that the other writers at the time, like Rousseau, who she targets, are missing out on or actually obscuring. And so we get an inside look at the themes that she wants to bring across, precisely because she is a woman and a feminist. But it's not as if her value is confined to just being part of the feminist canon. I think there's something wider there. And so it's a shame that she doesn't get read too far outside of that canon. So this is a good place to take a pause, and any questions or comments, objections, and then I'll talk about some of the key themes of this work. Yeah.
What was her own educational background? I mean, did
Oh.
kind of an abusive, was the schooling like background?
Well, it was like totally patchwork and haphazard. There were schools. Most of the schools were for boys. She actually writes about them in the Vindication, about how bad boarding schools are. She advocates for what we nowadays look at as like, we call them schools, where you go during the day and then you come back home at night. Because the other options were schooling at home, which she thought in most cases, gets screwed up. The tutors aren't doing their job, the parents don't follow through on things, the kids, learn the wrong things by being, the top of the food chain in the house, and the servants having to be under them. Or you send them to boarding school, and then the kids are abusive to each other, the masters aren't very, very good, they learn a lot of vices, is the key term she uses in those, and they become bullies. So best thing is like day school, but those were there were very few of them. She and her sisters actually ran one for a while, which eventually went under, in part because she leaves to go take care of Fanny in Portugal and leaves her sisters in charge, and when she comes back, things are kind of a mess. She seems to have gotten, not all, but the great majority of the drive and brains of the family.
So not too much formal education, she just happened to...
Well, so it's an interesting thing to think about. We tend to associate learning with formal education, with some sort of deliberate structure. In her time, that was going on, but like I said, it was very haphazard. But many people who were educated were effectively either self-educated or had somebody who took an interest in their education and would suggest that you should read this, should read that. And that family that she got involved in, the Ardens, they were like that. When she goes to London, a whole new world opens up for her. Because now she's being exposed to all these, these brilliant thinkers. Well, some of them weren't so brilliant. Some mediocre, some brilliant. And they're all in discussion with each other about the events of the day. And so she's working at a publishing house. So she gets to read as much as she wants, She's translating contemporary works from French and German. And she's the kind of person, I think there's a lot of cases where, like, I would spend some time in a place and probably not pay much attention to what's going on. She was watching everything. She was drawing, ideas, as she would call it in her own sort of vernacular, stocking the storehouse of her understanding. And so, she didn't have as much formal education as one would like. Think about what she could have accomplished if she'd been allowed to go to university or something like that. But she made an awful lot of what she had. You would never guess it by reading the Vindication, that it's not somebody who had gone to university. Well, let me talk about a few of her key ideas then. So one of these is this notion of human development that she has. This is actually in the first quotation. She says, "In what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist?" And she lays out three things. She says the answer is as clear as that half is less than the whole. Reason, rationality. That's what it means to be human. To be, this is an old philosophical definition of human being, rational animal. Rationality for her is not something we can just sort of take for granted that everybody, has. It's like a muscle. It has to be developed. And then she says, what acquirement exalts one being over another? Virtue. And now when we hear this term virtue, it's got kind of a fusty, old-fashioned sound to it, I think, for many people. What they mean there is moral excellence. And so when we talk about, traits that we like in people, like honesty, courage, frankness, those are virtues. When we talk about traits that we really dislike in people, like greediness or being a bully, those are what they call vices. Those are the opposites of virtue. And so to really live a full human life means to cultivate the virtues for Mary Wollstonecraft. And the third thing she says, why were the passions implanted in us, the emotions, the drives? That man, by struggling with them, might attain a degree of knowledge denied to the brute's whispers experience. So we're supposed to have feelings and drives, but we're not just supposed to give in to them. We're supposed to apply reason to them. We're supposed to steer them towards moral excellence. And by doing that, we learn about ourselves. We learn things that other people may not be able to come up with if they don't live that kind of life. That is what we call in ethics moral perfectionism. There's this notion. It's got nothing to do with what we normally call perfectionism right now, which is like a bad, I'm always going to be falling short of some sort of standard, so why even try, or I've got to work my fingers to the bone. What it means is this idea that human nature can be perfected. It can be brought to what it was supposed to be. And along with this goes the idea that in most cases it's not. Most human potential is not realized. In her time, and I think if she were in our time, she'd say most human potential is not fully realized either. But that's the goal. That's what makes life truly valuable. It's not to say that life isn't valuable at all, but that is what drives the human being to become what a fully human being, or fully human way of being is like. And that's something that doesn't happen, with a person on a desert island. It's something we do in society. It's something we do through relationships. In her case, she talks about marriage and how that plays a role in that. So this sounds, when I portray it like that, we might say that's a little overly intellectual and moralistic. But she doesn't mean it that way. She thinks that you want to be a fully integrated human person, so that your emotional life and your intellectual, rational life and your relationships, they all fit in with each other. They don't generate massive conflicts like we often see, or decisions where you have to say, well, I'm going to turn my brain off because I'd rather just go with my feelings. We don't see that work out too well in most cases. Now, she thought, and this is a revolutionary idea at the time, and she's going against many of the revolutionary philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She thought men and women are equally capable of developing this human nature. And that's where she's taking her stand. And she's going against almost everybody writing at the time in saying that. She's using herself without referencing herself, but she's providing an example of the capacity to do this. Now, she thinks that many men don't develop human nature fully because of their own choices, because of their professions. She thinks soldiering is not particularly a good idea, but it's not as bad as being in the Navy, because at least soldiers get to travel around to places, whereas guys in the Navy are stuck on a ship with just each other's company and develop all sorts of vices. General culture also plays a role. The class system, relations of prestige and power and wealth. All these things keep a lot of men from developing their human potential. She thinks that women have it much worse, in part because gender relations have kept them confined largely to the household. If you think about what goes into having a job, why is having a job important? We tend to think about it in terms of I get to make some money, put some, as we say, put some food on the table and a roof over the the house and clothing on our back, and that's important. But, from her perspective, having a job is important because it allows you to see the world, to develop your skills, to make something of yourself, not just in a financial way, but in terms of the kind of person that you are. I'm not sure she would say that about all jobs, but now she points out that this development is not going to occur if women are kept in the position that they're in. So if there's going to be this great French Revolution and you want it to see its successful finish, women have to have their situation changed. And they're probably going to be dragged kicking and screaming because they've already been enculturated to think that, I just want to spend time at home. I don't want to do all this other stuff. So it's probably going to take several generations of change before we see some real results, she would say. And she notes that a lot of these progressive thinkers are not actually progressive when it comes to women and their condition in society. Now the problem with that is, as she points out, is if you want a better society for men, and you want men to develop their potential, and you want them to be virtuous and to develop their intellects, that's not going to happen when the rest of society is a mess. So it's even, male domination is a bad idea even for the men. She's making the argument, which is a great argument to make, because she has to actually reach out to both. She talks about education. There's another key idea of hers, and she says, to go to that question of education, she says, education by itself doesn't make that big of a difference. Why? Well, because education in the real sense takes place in the household, in the family, seeing what mom and dad do, how they treat each other, seeing what goes on in the world, what happens in whatever profession you're in. All of that provides us with education that in many cases tells us much more about the realities of things than what we learn out of books. And we see this happen all the time. We send kids to university, and then later on, why do we have them do internships? I mean, you're in university right now. Are you doing an internship?
No, not yet.
Well, you should be, right? Because why do you need an internship?
To get more experience.
Yeah, exactly. Now, why couldn't you just get that out of the classroom? Because it's not that kind of experience, right?
Yeah.
So sooner or later, you need to learn things, and then whenever you go and get a job, they're going to train you anyway in all sorts of things. There's things you need to learn. So your education is never really finished. And our education in that broader sense forms us. And it tells us what's valuable. It tells us the way the world really works. It tells us what kind of people we ought to be. So if that's giving us the wrong messages, we're going to have a lot of problems. And if you think about what are the messages that women were getting at the time, she talks about this. In domestic education, women are learning handicrafts. And so they're not just learning how to sew, they're learning that sewing is really important, and that's what they should be focusing their attention on. And other stuff, they should stay out of that. That's a lesson that they're learning. They're learning all sorts of manners instead of learning genuine, as she calls it, genuine morals. They're learning what she calls the cultivation of the small virtues rather than the important virtues. And you think about, we still have these debates today, like when it comes to toys. Should we steer girls towards dolls? And if boys have them, we call them action figures, I remember my grandfather was pretty cut and dried in his idea of gender roles. Saw me playing with my sister with stuffed animals when I was a kid. And he'd get really, really upset because those were dolls to him. And boys don't play with dolls. Now, in my mind, they weren't dolls because they were stuffed animals, so they're a different classification. But what's going on when we send these sort of messages? She talks, for example, also about exercise. Girls not being allowed to run around and exercise and being brought to a kind of sickly state as a result, and that being treated as if it's normal, as if that's the way things ought to be. When we steer people culturally in these sorts of directions, we shouldn't be surprised then when women don't develop intellectually or morally. And if they do, it's going to be despite the system rather than because of the system that we're in. So somebody like Wollstonecraft would be the exception, right? Now she notes a kind of catch-22. You guys are all familiar with that term where you're kind of it doesn't work one way, it doesn't work the other way. It comes from a very great book called Catch-22, where they're sent out on these bombing missions, and if you want to get out of the bombing mission, you have to show that you're insane. Now, if you can show that you don't want to go on the bombing mission, that's sane. So that means that you have to be sent back out onto the bombing mission. So it's a kind of circular thing you can never satisfy. Here's the argument that she's trying to combat, that men were making. Why should we bother educating women? Why should we create opportunities for them? Look at the way that they act. They don't develop their minds. They're just interested in dress and fashion and chasing after guys to become their husbands and, romance novels and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, so the conclusion of that is, well, we shouldn't give them opportunities for anything to be different because they're just going to squander them. And she points out, that's completely backwards. It's precisely because you haven't given them opportunities for generation after generation after generation that women are confined to these sorts of things, and after a while come to see them as natural. If you think about it today, we still have a massive fashion industry, and one of the things, that I, when I look at my female students and I talk with them about this, I actually feel bad for them because I've mentioned this in other lectures. I bought this 10 years ago. I can keep wearing this for another 10 years unless I get fatter than I already am, and I've got plenty of room in here. So, this tie, maybe it'll go out of fashion in 10 years. I can keep wearing it. Women's fashion, how quick does it turn around? They have, every season. And why do women care about that? Because our culture pushes that. And so long as our culture is, sending this message so strongly across every single band of media, it's not a surprise if women spend, time thinking about fashion and men get to have a pass and wear the same jacket for 20 years. We can say the same thing about many other things, where there's a group and they're disadvantaged. They don't do well because they're disadvantaged. That not doing well is used as the justification for continuing the disadvantage. It's a general problem. She's identifying this as happening with women in culture. And she's pointing out how irrational this really is. And then she's pointing out, if you want to change this part of it, you need to do this. If you want to change this part of it, you need to do this. So that's sort of a good segue into the two things that I actually do have handouts for you about. Her discussion of sexual desire and marriage and friendship is really quite interesting. She actually says, I realize that people are going to say she's going way too far in saying bad stuff about love. And then she says, but I'm going to say it anyway. Here's the problem. Love in terms of sexual desire and infatuation is not an adequate basis for a lasting, she's thinking about marriage. We might broaden it to think about romantic relationships in general. It doesn't provide a sufficient basis. And then you have to ask, once the sexual desire wanes, what's going to come in its place? And so we can look at these two different sort of models. One is the typical marriage of the time. She says it has its original motives in sexual desire. So does the good marriage, too, the better marriage, by the way. Now, the problem is that this passion is not long-lasting. And, we see this as a problem in our own time, too, right? It's a perennial issue. They were talking about this back in ancient Greece, too. And it's not refined into something else. It degenerates to what she just calls an appetite. We might call that just sort of a drive. The partners may stop feeling love towards each other, but desire to feel that love or that desire from somebody else. And so they'll look for it in other people. And this leads to infidelities and conflicts and all sorts of things like that. Then, well, what should come in its place? Well, you can have a life together, so you move in together and you're in the same spot. And a common life together, like she says, that can produce a kind of mutual affection. But that affection is likely to be just a matter of what she calls fondness. And this is not a good term for her. She sees fondness as what you exhibit towards pets and children, not towards somebody who you consider to be your equal. And she talks about a lot of situations where the wives are, feeling love or whatever it is towards their husband, and the husbands are looking at them as if they're basically like a pet, not on their same level. A better marriage, she thinks, would be based on recognition of equality. So it begins with sexual desire, which she thinks is great. Human race gets to continue. She actually says, I'm not knocking, this is paraphrasing, she doesn't say these words, but I'm not knocking sexual desire or sexuality. I'm just saying that it's not the be-all and end-all, and you want to make sure that there's certain limitations to it and that you're prudent about it. As the passion of love wanes in a good marriage, for her, it's refined and replaced by others. And the partners may continue to feel that towards each other, but she says it shouldn't be so excessive that it's keeping them from fulfilling their duties or doing the other things to cultivate themselves. Instead, they should have a common life that includes shared intellectual life and what she calls sentiments. And by this, she means an emotional life, but not one that's just about, say, binging on Netflix or just, sitting around and eating all the time. It's I like this music. I can tell you about why I like it. Let's have a conversation about this sort of thing. I just read this great book, or the political affairs of the time are happening. Let's have a conversation about it. It doesn't necessarily have to all be agreement, too. It could be disagreement. But there has to be some sort of mutual respect there. And she thinks that when both partners feel respect towards the other, and you can only feel respect, in her view, towards somebody who actually has qualities that are worth respecting. Somebody who is choosing to develop their intellect, somebody who is choosing to develop their character. Then you can have a relation of friendship. And so she says friendship should be what ends up coming after love. And she says in one famous part, when love wanes, something else is going to come in its place. It's either going to be friendship or it's going to be indifference. You have to pick which one it's going to be. Now, you're only really capable of friendship if you cultivate your character. And if you're prevented from doing that, which she thinks is the case for many of the women of her time, then it shouldn't be a surprise to the man when his wife doesn't turn out to be somebody that he particularly, respects. He probably isn't either, by the way, too, because of all sorts of other factors, including the condition of the woman that he's involved in. So she thinks that marriage should, on the one hand, be pushed less as the sort of go-to for women. You've got to think about who you're going to marry. But she thinks that if you do that, and women are allowed to develop their capacities by, say, having a job, being out in the world, then you've got the possibility for a culture where better marriages could become the norm, rather than being an exception. So that's an interesting idea, I think. One I fully endorse myself. Another is her analysis of modesty. I've got this other handout for you. When we think about modesty, when people talk about that these days, it's often still framed in terms of sexuality and dress and comportment. And it was in her time as well. And she deliberately shifts gears and says, no, modesty is actually a virtue men and women should have equally. And it's what what used to be called humility, but in medieval times, but now is this sort of middle ground. So it's in between the vice of pride or vanity, people making too much of themselves, and humility, where people don't make enough of themselves, where they sort of like deliberately lower themselves. And it's this middle position, the virtuous mean, if we want to think about Aristotle. A modest person possesses the correct opinion about themselves. So if they're not a particularly good guy, being modest means admitting that and not thinking that you deserve everything. On the other hand, if you are particularly good at something, like she uses the example of George Washington and John Milton, John Milton's a pretty good poet. He is entitled to claim that he's a great poet. That's being modest for him. It's not being prideful. If he claims he's a great chef as well because he's a great poet, he's probably being prideful, right? If he says that his poems aren't any good, he's being overly humble. This has nothing to do with sexuality. This has everything to do with the development of the human person. And Wollstonecraft considers this virtue to be one of the centerpieces of the virtues. If you don't have modesty, the other virtues aren't going to be very easy to develop. She does also talk about, in that chapter where she's discussing that, she talks about several other things that are connected with sexuality. She talks about bashfulness as not being modesty. Bashfulness is just ignorance about things, and as soon as somebody becomes knowledgeable about them, they quickly shift into a state of sort of impudence, she calls it. She uses the examples of country girls who come to the city, seem to be very, very modest, they're really bashful, they get a little bit of a life experience, and now they become very brazen. She's talking about prostitutes, actually. And she also talks about chastity. She thinks that chastity is not a virtue that should be, simply imposed on women, that if men are going to talk about the importance of chastity, they ought to be practicing it themselves. So, sort of equality in that matter. She also has another great discussion where she talks about the fact that at that time, and she's maybe even referring to her own case, all it takes is finding out that somebody's had one sexual affair outside of the bounds of marriage, and their reputation is ruined. And she says, this is completely crazy. Think about how many young women's lives have been ruined this way by getting involved with guys who use them and then just, take off or have no intention of being with them. Why does all the opprobrium fall on these women and none on these guys? And she's quite right about that, I think. And that is something that we still do see sometimes happening in our society. So this is another good place to take a little pause. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the afterlife of the Vindication. Any questions? Any comments? Reactions?
How widely read was this work of hers?
Oh. So when it was first published, and then for several years afterwards, very widely read. After her reputation is damaged, it's not read much at all until reprinting in the 1830s. And even then, in a lot of circles, it's seen as kind of scandalous. It's the kind of book that you probably wouldn't want people to know that you're reading. And then, nowadays, people, there's no, you read something like this, and people think you're an antiquarian, right? Why are you reading that, that 200-year-old book? But yeah, it was. So, in its time, before William Godwin managed to screw things up, it was really being read quite a lot and provoking a lot of thought.
Was it well received?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. It was well received. The people who attacked it were the people you would expect to attack it, right? So that's actually a sign that she was on the right track in many respects. But it had favorable reviews. Her husband is able to just call his memoir the memoirs of the writer of the Vindication of the Rights of Women, because everybody knows who she is. She's never even named. Bless her.
So is she able to make because I was wondering,
Yeah.
talking through this, how on earth she could travel?
She was a successful woman writer. She had a novel before that, and bless you, the other Vindication. She published some things pseudonymously, synonymously. I always get that word screwed up. And then she had translations that she published as well, and I imagine she probably was paid for those. I don't know exactly about the financial arrangements, but she was making a decent living. Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's, she was doing something that women hadn't done before that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about her influence on Mary Shelley? Mary Shelley marries this great poet, writes Frankenstein.
Well, she's not around to influence her because she dies.
So Mary Shelley just kind of creates herself.
Well, so we were talking about this before. I don't know that much about Mary Shelley myself, her biography. I would imagine that she'd read her mother's writings. Her father was very close, and actually published posthumously the stuff that hadn't come out yet. So you get to know somebody a bit through their writing, I would say. At least really good authors you do. My mom and dad both died a long time ago. My dad when I was 11 and my mom when I was 29. And among my mom's stuff, I found my dad's love letters to her. And I sat down, and there were a lot. I don't have hers to him. I don't know what happened to them. But they spanned a period of about 2 years, because they were in different colleges at that time. He was up in Madison, and she was down at DePaul. And she would come visit and stuff like that. And it was interesting, because I already knew these people, right? But I got to see a whole different side of him and also her as she was portrayed in his letters, than I'd seen as a kid, an 11-year-old kid when he died. It was interesting because I was much older than he was at the time that he wrote the letters. When I was reading them, reading them as a graduate student when he'd written them as a young undergrad. But you do get to know somebody through that, and then there's family friends. Mary Wollstonecraft moved in these circles, and presumably she must have made quite an impression on her husband, William Godwin. Clearly loved her. He wasn't a very prudent guy, unfortunately. Yeah.
That was my question. What was his motivation for writing the expose?
So it appears that it was to be like a monument to her genius and her memory.
Oh, you said it was kind of clueless.
Yeah, I think so. And people told him before he published it, this is a terrible idea. This is going to lead to this, and he ignored it, or he discounted it. I think maybe he thought he was smarter than the rest of them too, that way as well. He thought he knew her better, and they did know each other quite well. They appear to have had that kind of marriage, by the way, for the short period that they had, that she's sketching out there, a marriage that becomes friendship, but is still amorous at the same time. Something that's very much an ideal, I think, in a lot of our discussions of relationships today. A lot of people spend quite a lot of time, and there's a lot of ink spilled on what is the ideal relationship like. I don't, not a lot of people who fully attain it. She's laying it out. It could be in part because she's right. That we do need to change some things yet. Yeah.
Did this spawn any surge in other women talking and forming groups, or was it just sort of an anomaly of the times?
It could have if Godwin hadn't screwed things up, I think. Because she
so
does
there wasn't
influence.
enough time between the book and his screwing it up for anything to get...
It's less than a decade. Mm-hmm. And... other women writers would come on the scene afterwards and say some of the things that Wollstonecraft herself had said, and then people who read Wollstonecraft would recognize that. But it didn't spur, like you're talking about, women getting together and reading her, because it was just kind of a bad idea to be caught doing that. And then by the time that feminism really gets rolling in the 20th century, the opprobrium is gone, but now you've got new authors that are more contemporary. Why not just focus on them, like Simone de Beauvoir, for example? And so it's too bad because she's really ahead of her time in many respects. I've got a quote actually from Virginia Woolf that I was going to end with that would be kind of good to bring up at this point. It's from her second Common Reader, which is 1932, so it's mid-century. She says, "Many millions have died and been forgotten since she was buried, and yet as we read her letters and listen to her arguments and consider her experiments and realize the high-handed and hot-blooded manner in which she cut her way to the quick of life, one form of immortality is hers undoubtedly. She is alive and active. She argues and experiments. We hear her voice and trace her influence even now among the living." So there was a kind of contemporaneity to Wollstonecraft's discussions, even though they're situated in England and France of the late 18th century, where she's still talking to us today. And she was talking, Woolf felt that she was talking to her generation at that time. I think that she still has a lot relevant. When I use her in class, many of my young students say, yeah, there's still a lot to this work that's relevant for us. But that said, I think that there's probably some aspects of her work that contemporary feminists might find questionable. All this talk about virtue, that seems a little moralistic. Heavy focus on the intellectual life as opposed to the emotional life. Some would say that's bifurcation. That's a problem. There's also the fact that Wollstonecraft was for what we would nowadays call equality feminism as opposed to gender feminism. Sometimes it's framed in terms of waves and stuff like that. So Wollstonecraft would be seen by some feminists as, a little bit too conservative in certain respects. But I think that's part of what gives her a great appeal, on the other hand. I certainly find her analyses of what we do in our social lives and our relationships pretty appealing. And, they're 200 years old, but they still seem to be dead on in many respects. Let me tell you a little bit about, as we bring us to a close, I'll tell you a little bit more about the afterlife of the work. So, like I said, it really did take off well. Sold a lot of copies, multiple editions, translation, and then, she dies, and unfortunately her legacy falls into Godwin's hands, and he publishes this tell-all that ends up damaging her reputation. So she's her work lives a kind of underground life after that. And even some of her close friends, like this woman Mary Hayes, end up trying to distance themselves from Wollstonecraft after her death, kind of publicly. But, that's why you couldn't have like a Wollstonecraft reading circle or anything like that. And by the 1830s, it's getting reprinted, but it's still got that bad book reputation attached to it. You wouldn't want somebody seeing you. Certainly wouldn't bring it into church or anything like that, right? Now, what's interesting is that John Stuart Mill, this utilitarian philosopher in England, he's going to make a lot of the same arguments that she's making in his book, The Subjugation of Women, in the 1860s, the late 1860s. He's making a lot of the same arguments about human development and virtue, bless you, in some of his other works as well. So, it's one of those ironies where it's okay if a guy says it, but if a woman says it, then maybe it's a little bit more questionable even then. So a lot of people know these ideas through Mill rather than through Wollstonecraft, unfortunately. She becomes an influence on women writers as the 19th century comes to an end, and she's a bit rehabilitated. I think by that time, the people who would be offended have forgotten who she is, so that's okay, And then, women who are interested in women's liberation and in equality start reading her again and seeing just how much there is there. I don't think there were a lot of guys reading her until, well, I haven't actually known many guys to read her, period. She gets kind of pushed off into like women's literature, which is really a shame, because she deserves, in my opinion, as far as social thought, to be placed up there with people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who she's criticizing, or looking ahead, John Stuart Mill, or some of these other great male philosophers. I think she can go toe to toe with them. She didn't get to write as much, unfortunately, because she dies pretty young. So that's sort of my assessment of her. We have a little bit of time for any sort of general questions or comments or discussion. If you guys want to, if there's things that you want to bring up. Or...
So is there a woman philosopher of her time or earlier that gets the same respect as a...
Today, you mean?
Yeah.
There's been some discussion recently about this woman, Olympe de Gouges, who was a French woman, gets executed during the Revolution, writes some pretty interesting works, also, of course, dies very young. There's a few others, but I don't think there's anybody who really matches her for sheer force of intellect. She actually talks about a lot of the other women writers of the time at one point in the Vindication, and why she thinks that it's great that they're women writers, but they're just not doing their job. They're not going far enough with the points that they're making. I mean, there are other women philosophers, we were talking about this before class, before her, who really are first-rate philosophers. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was a correspondent with René Descartes, deserves to be up there. Christina Pizan, who I don't know quite so much about, another important philosopher. Cavendish, another one. And then there's plenty after her, of course. And the 20th century was really great. It's funny because, I do these YouTube videos, and I think I had one where I don't know exactly what it had to do with, but somehow it got brought up about women and philosophy, and some troll wrote on there, women can't do philosophy, just sort of typical blah 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 stuff. And I was like, he had a challenge. Show me one good woman philosopher. I was like, in the 20th century, how many do we have? We have Hannah Arendt, just major, first-rate social theorist. She's known for being involved with Martin Heidegger, but she's probably smarter than him in many respects. We have Edith Stein, great phenomenologist. We have Simone de Beauvoir. We can just go down the list. We have contemporary ones like Judith Butler. The reason I'm pointing over there is because this young woman over here is doing a very interesting series on women philosophers. So we have plenty of examples now. We have to do a lot more work going back in history. But the thing that I really like about Wollstonecraft is, although she's writing about women's things, she's not expecting any sort of I'm getting special treatment because I'm a woman. She wants to be a philosopher. And the fact that she's a woman means she's going to talk about women's issues, but she's going to talk about everything she can. And I find that really great. So,
just a comment. You talked about John Stuart Mill sort of co-opting Mary Wollstonecraft. And I was thinking about my undergraduate education. Okay, I never heard of Mary Wollstonecraft, but I had to read John Stuart Mill.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And it was like, in response to the question of women philosophers, the suggestion that John Stuart Mill had all these great ideas sort of put down the idea that a woman originated those ideas that he took up. You know what I'm saying? It's like the 20th century education of women, as liberating as it is, illustrated or triumphed men's ideas. And I never heard of Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yeah, and she's saying at the time, because she doesn't have a John Stuart Mill around, but she does have a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who everybody's talking about.
I have read him too.
Well, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau is talking about, these wild thoughts about everybody should be free and all that, except for women. And she's reading it, and she's like, what? I'm not going to swear, but I think she probably would have, the first reading of that. Because, it's precisely what you're talking about, this notion that somehow why would only, unless you have some sort of actual deficit on the part of women, why would there be so few women contributing? Well, it's not a deficit, it's social dynamics, But anyway, we could talk a lot about that,
Remember when I was getting my undergraduate, I was going to a women's college, and Vindication and the yellow wallpaper were kind of passed around, we're in on a secret now.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then you read it and it just blows your mind.
Yeah.
Because you're on one level you're taught in the classes about all of these
The canon.
Right, and then it's like, but there's also this stuff out there, so it was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I always think it's funny when you think how contemporary she is, and it's like, it's because things haven't changed that much.
Well,
in a lot of ways.
when I asked my female students about that, I would pose a question, and a lot of my teaching is online, so I can make it an online discussion forum, and I'll say, okay, so we have equal opportunity, and there's more of you women in my class than there are men, which is actually true, and women have a higher retention rate than male students in general. So it seems like we're doing pretty good. What's still particularly relevant? And then they'll say, well, romantic relationships, she's dead on about that. The fashion industry, she's dead on about that. As a matter of fact, maybe we're worse off now than when they had to make their own clothes. There's all these facets where, and that's probably, if I'm gonna, I shouldn't just sort of sit in my armchair philosophizing thing and say, well, I'm sure that for women, what's relevant in Wollstonecraft's analysis is blah blah blah. Because I don't know, right? I'm a 45-year-old guy, presumably not having the same consciousness as a 20-year-old woman who's in college. So I asked them, and they're the ones who say, yeah, this stuff is totally relevant. It's also good then because I don't have to take if anything goes wrong, I don't have to take the blame for it. So, but the male students don't have a problem reading Wollstonecraft. A few, but they're the ones who have a problem reading everything. So it's not about being.
It's not about her.
Yeah.
I found it interesting that the example you gave of what was most scandalous in the memoir was her suicide attempt.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering partly what was the real serious scandal, but it strikes me that that's one that's still a bugaboo today, that mental illness is the great taboo.
There was that. What I said is that he sort of glorified her suicide attempts. But the having a kid out of wedlock was really a clincher too.
So before then, her first child had been.
Well,
she was
guy,
married. They were registered in Paris, but they gave all the details, all the sordid details in the thing.
Yeah, her first daughter's name was Fanny, named after her friend Fanny.
Yeah.
I mean, there were other things too. So,
Yeah.
some people want to read, that there was like a homosexual relationship between her and Fanny Blood. It all depends on how you want to, what you want to make out of certain sentiments. Clearly, they were very close. They weren't intimate in that way. But for some people at that time, that's all you had to sort of hint at, and that would be a big problem too. So those are probably the main things in his memoir. But that was enough. I mean, it was so easy to be scandalized back then. And the same people who had negative reviews of her books just went to town with this memoir. It's too bad because there's a lot of missed opportunities.
I couldn't help but think about a little bit about Downton Abbey.
Yeah?
When you were talking about the castes, you know, the system that she was a part of, it seems to me that Downton Abbey illustrated that that system was still pretty much in place, although Julian Fellows wanted to suggest that it was an end of an era. I don't know if you are a Downton Abbey fan or...
I'm not, but I know enough about the show to have like an idea about how that would fit together. Yeah, you know, one of the things where Wollstonecraft does get criticized a bit is that she thinks that it's very important to cultivate oneself and make one's way into the middle class. That the middle class is where the real repository of virtue comes in. You know, we might see that as questionable. I myself don't, but a lot of people do criticize her on that basis. You can say, how does this apply to servant girls, for example? You know, but I don't think that's an insurmountable criticism. She was really looking for a society that would develop towards liberation of all people. And then the thing that goes along with that is, it's sort of like Martin Luther King's, my dream is that someday my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So if their character is no good, go ahead and judge them and tell them that they're screwing up and that they, deserve the whatever crappy situation they're in. She would say the same thing about women. You give women the opportunity to do stuff, and then they say, no, I'd rather just take it easy. Well, then that's their problem. But actually let them have the opportunity to do that, and then you can sort of sift out who the people who are willing to develop themselves from the people who are just want to consume all day or something like that, right? It's not fair to criticize people if they sit around and consume all day, if that's all that's available to them. Or it's not fair to criticize people for not making something of themselves in terms of education if they have to put in 12-hour days and they're dead tired at the end of that and don't want to crack a book, when they get back to their room, their closet or something like that. Think about people in servants' quarters, right? So, it looks like it's time to wrap up, right?
Yeah, we're good. Not for everyone's ready.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns? Well, thanks very much for coming out. I'm happy to
Thank
have
you. That's great.